Hey guys, trying out some new software today. I know how much you miss seeing my face, so I decided to include the little bubble here. But today what we're going to be doing is our notes on response, okay, mostly focused on nervous control. And as far as this unit, we finished with a marathon runner. We learned about a bunch of body systems, how they interact, how they maintain homeostasis. We have a few more that weren't covered in the marathon runner section, so we're going to be doing that next couple videos, and then we'll be completed with this unit. So we'll be ready to move on after that. So to begin, when we talk about response, what we're talking about is how organisms respond to both internal and external stimuli. So what does that word mean? A stimulus is information that is either coming into the organism from the outside, from the external environment, or it could be internal stimuli, information from within the organism itself, and how the organism responds to that. And so typically there's two forms of response that different types of organisms undergo. Nervous control, which is usually a quicker response time, a shorter acting response to a stimulus, or there's also chemical control, which we talked about as we discussed the endocrine system of hormones. And chemical control is often slower, but can be longer acting than nervous control. So as we have for our other systems, we'll talk about how different types of organisms respond to stimuli. We'll talk about some of the characteristic organisms we've been going over, and then we will focus mainly on humans. So in single-celled organisms such as protists, first of all, what's important to know is that they're single-celled, so they don't have neurons, nerve cells, they don't have a nervous system, but they do have structures that allow them to process information, take in information, and then respond accordingly. So, even protists like a paramecium or euglena or an amoeba, they can sense conditions using special structures. They can sense light. For example, this picture over here, this is a euglena, a photosynthetic protist, and it can this little orangish spot is a structure that's sensitive to light. Again, this is a single cell. Okay, so this is not an eye or it's not an organ. It's just a special structure within the cell that's sensitive to light because the euglena is photosynthetic. So it needs to be able to sort of move itself towards light so it can undergo photosynthesis. Protists can sense pH, oxygen, carbon dioxide. They can find food molecules. All of this requires information and response. They have special structures which allow them to coordinate the movement of the cilia, for example, in the paramecium, and the movement of the flagellum, okay, in the euglena. So even though they're just simple single-celled organisms, they do have some means of coordinating a response to information. If we move into animals, for example, the hydra. Okay, the hydra doesn't have a central nervous system, doesn't have a brain, doesn't have a spinal cord. Instead, it has what's called a neural net, a sort of network of nerve cells that sort of permeate the organism, and that nerve net helps to coordinate the functioning of the hydra, helps it to capture its prey, to sense prey, to immobilize and put it into its body cavity and so forth. So there is some control within the hydra. The earthworm, as we sort of move up in complexity into the annelids, the earthworm is an organism that has a more complex system of neural tissue. So it doesn't quite have a brain. It has some enlarged areas of nerve tissue called the ganglia. Okay, the earthworm has two of these that are fused, and then it has a ventral nerve cord. Ventral is sort of the belly side of the organism. So what we see here in the earthworm is the ganglia here, which we sort of think about almost as the brain. It's a simple nervous system. And then the nerve cord goes down the belly side of the worm, the underside of the worm, if you imagine it sort of crawling around through the earth. And so that nerve cord there helps to carry information from the ganglia down throughout the body of the earthworm, helping coordinate the contraction of muscles and so forth. Earthworms do not have sort of advanced senses. They don't have eyes and ears and so forth, but they do have cells that are sensitive to light, that are sensitive to sound, that allow them to find food and sort of know where they're going and so forth. Grasshopper is a little bit similar to the earthworm. However, the ganglia are larger. Okay, and so we see that the earthworm nerve cord also travels down the ventral side of the organism. So compared to the earthworm, however, the grasshopper and other insects have much better sensory receptors, special cells to take in information from the outside. For example, insects have antennae which they can use to sort of smell and sense molecules in the air. They have compound eyes which they can take in light and see. They have a tympanum, basically an eardrum in which they can hear, very fine hairs that are sensitive to touch and pressure, and palps in the mouth parts which allow them to taste different molecules. So they have much more advanced sensory receptors. So we move into humans, and this sort of applies mostly to mammals in general. We'll talk quite a bit here about some of the structures of the human nervous system. And so let's put me up here. In humans, nerve control happens utilizing what we call a central and peripheral nervous system. We'll talk a little bit about that. So in humans, we have quite a highly developed nervous system. When I mentioned the earthworm and the grasshopper, there was a ventral nerve cord, a bundle of nerve tissue going down sort of the belly side of the organism. Mammals and other vertebrates have a dorsal nerve cord. So we have a nerve cord that goes down the back side of our bodies. And that's true of the other vertebrates as well. And so information moves around through the nervous system using what we call nerve impulses. We'll talk about those in a minute. But these impulses travel along certain pathways, okay? And that allows for information to be taken in, allows for information from the central nervous system to affect certain cells in the organism. In humans, we have highly developed sensory nerves, sensory receptors we call them, that take in information from the surroundings. And along with our endocrine system, the nervous system helps to coordinate and control activity in our bodies. So we need to define a few words here as we talk about the nervous system. And so The information coming into the system is called stimulus or stimuli. So this can be, as we said, information from the outside world, or it might be information coming from within the body as well. That can also be a stimulus. So stimuli come in. Stimulus is detected by receptors, special cells who are adapted to taking in certain types of information. Examples would be light receptors in our eye, pressure receptors in our skin, and temperature receptors. These are the structures that can actually sense something about the stimulus. The impulse is the actual signal that's being moved from one part of the system to another. Okay? Nerve impulses use a combination of sort of electrical and chemical signals that move down nerve cells, which are called neurons. The response is how the organism actually reacts to the stimulus, how it affects another structure, another part of the organism. And the effectors are the structures that actually produce the response. Okay, such as muscles, for example. So if we look at the diagram that's down below, it'll help us understand this a little bit. Let's just imagine somebody kicks a soccer ball to you. So as that soccer ball is traveling through the air, okay, the eyes are taking in the stimulus. The stimulus would be the path the ball's taking. Okay, the size of the ball. That information is coming into receptors in the eye. It's being sent down sensory nerves to the brain. And then the brain makes sense of this information coming in. So it's the brain that will use that information to determine, okay, what is the path this ball's following? How quickly is it coming? Okay, what is the angle that it's taking? So that information is processed in the brain, part of the central nervous system. And then the response also starts in the brain. And so the brain determines, okay, where do I need to go to receive this ball? How do I present the surface I'm going to receive it with? And so then the brain determines the response, sends that information through another type of neuron called motor neurons, which connect to the muscles, for example. The muscles would be the effectors. And the brain coordinates its response to move the person in the path of the ball, to present their foot, to receive the ball, how to move to cushion the ball in, and all that coordinated response is produced from the brain, from the central nervous system. So that's sort of the path from a stimulus in processing in the central nervous system and then responding by the effectors. When we talk about our nerves, what we're talking about are these groups of neurons. Neurons are individual nerve cells that branch out to and from the central nervous system, bringing information back and forth. So let's look at an individual nerve cell. So a nerve cell is called a neuron. It has a pretty distinctive shape that we can recognize. It's sort of often elongated. There's variety here. This is sort of a generic neuron. And so neurons are adapted to taking information, receiving signals, sending them from one place to another. So in here we have a diagram of an individual neuron. And we're going to just talk about the parts of that neuron, and then we will and then we'll talk about what the function of those various parts are. So these branches that we see at the end, they're called the dendrites. Okay, I sort of describe those as sort of the portions of the neuron that are kind of listening for a signal from another neuron. The cell body is the part of the neuron where you would find most of the organelles, the nucleus, sometimes called the cyton or the soma. It has the nucleus inside of it. And then there's this sort of elongated part of the neuron. It's called the axon. And then at the end of the neuron are what we call the terminal branches, the end of the neuron. Now, along at the end of these terminal branches are what we call the synaptic knobs. You see here. Along the axon are the Schwann cells. I have to move myself somewhere else. The Schwann cells, which produce a special material called myelin. That's what you see here in yellow around the Schwann cells. And then there are these small little gaps between this myelin sheathing called the nodes of Ranvier. I don't know if you pronounce it in French, Ranvier. Sounds good. So let's talk about how information travels on a neuron. So nerve impulses can travel pretty quickly. Okay, they can travel about 300 miles per hour. Okay, and so a nerve impulse uses a chemical and electrical signal to be transmitted from down the neuron. Okay. And so this works because of a change in polarity. So in the axon of the nerve that we see here, we have the typical sort of resting conditions, okay, in which due to active transport of sodium and potassium ions, okay, there is a positive charge on the outside of the neuron and a negative charge on the inside of the neuron. Okay. And that's polarized, we call that. And so when a nerve impulse is received from the dendrite, what happens is there's initially what we call depolarization. That the polarization, the charge there, switches. And that depolarization travels down the length of the axon. You see that here. Eventually reaching, okay, the terminal. Okay. And once that nerve impulse reaches this terminal, neurotransmitters are released, which then can bind to receptors in the next neuron, and that signal would continue to another neuron, passing from this neuron to the next neuron that would be nearby. After this depolarization happens, okay, then active transport repolarizes the neuron, and once that has happened, then it can be sensitive to another nerve impulse traveling down. So we call this the action potential. So when we get to the end of the terminal, two neurons are not physically connected to each other. So this electrical signal, this polarization, travels down to those synaptic knobs to the terminal, and then it reaches the end of a neuron. And then there's a gap. And the electrical signal can't move past that gap. So then there is another method of sending that nerve impulse to the next cell. Okay. So that gap between, this would be the terminal of one neuron, and this would be the dendrites of the next neuron. So you'll notice they're not physically connected with each other. They're not attached to each other. There's a gap, and that gap is called the neuron, this microscopic gap between two neurons. And so once the nerve impulse reaches the terminal of one neuron, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters into the synapse, the synaptic cleft. And that's what you see, these little blue dots represent those neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters flow into the synaptic cleft, and then they could bind to receptor molecules that are on the dendrite of the next neuron. And when enough of these neurotransmitters bind to these receptors, that starts a nerve impulse traveling down the length of this next neuron. Eventually, these neurotransmitters are broken down by other types of molecules. Okay. And so, for example, there's several types of these neurotransmitters that are used in the nervous system. Acetylcholine is one common one that is used to activate muscles. So if this were a neuron bringing a message to a muscle cell, an effector, when these receptors, when acetylcholine is released by the terminal, when enough of the acetylcholine binds to these receptors, that would trigger the contraction of that muscle. And then other enzymes break down those neurotransmitters. When we look at the human nervous system, we can sort of split it into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The brain itself is a collection of neurons located protected by the cranium, the skull. And surrounding the brain are some membranes that surround it. They're called the meninges, and they have fluid between them to help sort of cushion the brain. It's called the cerebrospinal fluid. If you've ever heard of meningitis, is a disease when there's an infection within these layers surrounding the brain, which can lead to swelling and problems. So the brain is sort of split into three main parts. Okay. So this portion up here, okay, the largest portion of the brain is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is so different parts of the brain are responsible for different life functions. The cerebrum is the part of the brain that is the center of voluntary activity. It's the center for taking in information from the senses, coordinating motor function, the movement of our muscles, memory, emotions, thinking, learning, speech. Okay? All of that is controlled by the cerebrum. Horizontally, the cerebrum is split into two what are called hemispheres. You can see that division down the middle, and there's a left side and a right side of the brain. Sort of on the bottom beneath the cerebrum is another part of the brain called the cerebellum. Cerebellum is responsible for a lot of the coordination of activity. Coordinating of motor activities, balance, example, are controlled by the cerebellum. And then there's what was called the brain stem or the medulla oblongata. Okay, this is part of the brain, the very core parts of the brain that help with involuntary functioning of the organs, life-sustaining activities, okay, are controlled by that medulla oblongata portion. And it's the top part of the spinal cord. Activities that are coordinated by the medulla oblongata include breathing and heartbeat, blood pressure, reflexes, coughing, blinking, sort of core activities needed to stay alive. We can see sort of different views of this. We see, again, the cerebrum. In humans, the cerebrum is very large, largest portion of the brain. And in this diagram, it shows us sort of the difference between different types of animals. Okay, so in here you can see different types of vertebrates. Mammals have the most highly developed cerebrum. You can see the other types of vertebrates here. The dark pink is the cerebrum. You can see within vertebrates there are different levels of development of the cerebrum compared to other parts of the brain as well. There's a sort of fluid-filled space sort of in the core of the brain. Okay. There's also the hypothalamus, which sort of connects the nervous system to the endocrine system. So we learned they're coordinated together. Below our back of our head, the bottom is the cerebellum, and then side, sort of in the central area, is where the medulla oblongata is. And that's where the brain connects to the spinal cord. Over the years, scientists have traced different life functions and different responsibilities, I guess, to different parts of the brain. So different functions are coordinated by specific parts of the brain. And so over time, scientists have traced these. For example, we have, logical organizational functions in the prefrontal cortex. The olfactory bulb is responsible for smell, okay? Emotion, okay? Memory, language, vision. So different parts of the brain are connected to different specific functions. One way that scientists learn about this is through people that have had brain injuries. That when scientists find a person that has a very specific part of their brain has been injured, what they do is they look at then, what effect did that have on a person's functioning? And then they can sort of trace different functions, different parts of the brain. There's also newer methods of functional MRIs where scientists are able to see which parts of the brain are most active while a person is doing a certain activity. For example, if you had somebody playing the violin while their brain is being scanned with one of these functional MRI machines, scientists can see which parts of the brain are active as a person's conducting that activity. And that allows them to sort of trace how different parts of the brain work together to coordinate different activities. The peripheral nervous system is the second part of the human nervous system. So the brain and spinal cord are the central nervous system. Connected to the central nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system we can see in this diagram here. This is a central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. And then branching out, traveling throughout the body is the rest, the peripheral nervous system. So any nerves located outside of the peripheral of the central nervous system make up the peripheral nervous system. So we have these nerves that connect all throughout our body, helping bring information to and from the central nervous system. And so there are some nerves that connect directly to the brain. They're called the cranial nerves. Okay, and they are the parts, many of the sensory nerves that take in information from the eyes and the ears and the mouth and nose and so forth, come in through those cranial nerves. Okay, and then branching off are the spinal nerves. Okay. And the spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs of them. Okay, and they branch off through the vertebrae. So the vertebrae protect the spinal cord. Okay, but coming off of the spinal cord are these pairs of nerves. Okay, each going to each side of the body. And the top nerves are the cervical nerves, the very top of the spinal cord that branch out. These cervical nerves go out to the head and the neck, the diaphragm, the upper arms, the wrists, the hands. So the nerves that bring information back and forth through those parts connect to the spinal cord through these cervical nerves. The thoracic nerves are the next section. Okay. These are the nerves that go to the sort of trunk of the body, the core of the chest, okay, and the abdomen. Those nerves branch out from these thoracic nerves. Then there's sort of the lower back, the lumbar nerves, and those nerves branch off of the spinal cord and then go down to the legs. And then there's the very lowest most nerves, which go down also to the lower parts of the body, controlling the bladder and bowels and sexual functions as well. Those nerves come out through these sacral nerves. And so somatic nerves are the nerves that control voluntary muscles connected to the cerebrum, and then the autonomic nerves are in involuntary control. They're controlled not by the cerebrum. They're not under voluntary control. You can't purposefully control these nerves. But they are important in functioning, obviously. And so when a person, we probably have heard of people that have spinal cord injuries. And if a person has a spinal cord injury, what that means is somewhere along the spinal cord, there's been damage. It could be a break in the spinal cord. And nervous tissue does not heal very well, does not regenerate very well. It's not like a bone where if there's a break in your bone, it will heal over a period of 6 weeks. Damage to the spinal cord does not heal very well. And so if a person were to have a spinal cord injury, let's say down here in the lower lumbar nerves, or lumbar portion of the spinal cord, what that would mean is that even though everything below that damage is working correctly, all the muscles and the blood flow and so forth, person can't actually use their legs, because when their brain sends the signal telling their leg muscles to move and contract, the message goes down the spinal cord, but then it gets to the break and it can't go any further. So the message telling their legs to move doesn't arrive at the muscles. At the same time, a person will lose feeling in their lower parts of their body, because again, the sensory information from the legs is traveling up, but then it reaches the damaged area and cannot progress further to the brain. And so that sensory information is not getting in. So when a person has a spinal cord injury, the higher up the damage, the more loss of functioning that there's going to be, the more serious the damage is going to be. So we also have what are called reflex arcs built into our nervous system. And these are often functions that are protective in nature. And so, for example, we have sensors, pain sensors in our hand, in our skin all over, temperature sensors. So if you were to touch something hotter, you get a strong pain sensation. You touch this cactus. Okay, there's a special connection where that pain information travels through a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. It's connected by a small interneuron and then directly is connected to a motor neuron. So as soon as you have that pain sensation, or if you touch something really hot, you immediately pull your hand away very, very quickly. And the reason that can happen so quickly, you haven't even really felt the pain, or you haven't even felt that you burned yourself, but you've already removed your hand. And again, that's a protective reflex. If instead this information had to go all the way up to the brain, be processed, and then the brain had to send a signal to the muscles to move the hand, that would obviously result in more damage. So the quicker that can happen, the more protective it is. And so we have these reflex arcs, where basically have the information into the spinal cord and right back out to an effector. So to finish up, we're going to talk about a few malfunctions and diseases and disorders of the nervous system. And we just sort of, I've picked 8 of them or so, just to talk about, and there's obviously many more than these, but these are common ones. One is cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is caused when there's some sort of damage or injury to the brain, typically early in prenatal development or during the birthing process or relatively soon after birth. And obviously when a part of the brain is damaged, then whatever functions are controlled by that part are going to be impacted as well. So often cerebral palsy leads to difficulty in coordination and sort of motor functions, can result in speech problems or even paralysis or tremors. And there's not a cure for cerebral palsy. Often a person that has cerebral palsy might have certain types of therapy that can help them to minimize the loss of function or help them to improve how well they can do certain things to sort of cope with whatever damage has already been done. Just helps them adapt to those conditions. Meningitis, I mentioned earlier. So this is one that you sometimes hear about. There is a disease caused by either a bacteria or a virus that sort of invades that lining of the brain, and that leads to inflammation around the brain, around the spinal cord, which can then lead to damage to the brain itself, the brain tissue. It can be controlled if it's a bacterial meningitis, can be controlled by antibiotics. There are also vaccines for certain types of viruses that cause meningitis. Often students going to college will get meningitis vaccine because bacteria and viruses that spread meningitis can spread from person to person when they're in close contact like they would be at a college. Probably have heard of a stroke. So a stroke is caused by there's, for some reason, a lack of blood flow to the brain. And when the brain doesn't have a flow of blood, then cells don't have oxygen, don't have nutrients, waste builds up, and those parts of the brain can be damaged permanently. So a stroke can happen. Sometimes there's a blockage by a blood clot or something that prevents blood from getting to the brain. Other times there might be damage to a blood vessel that there's bleeding in the brain, and so that blood is not getting to where it's supposed to get. And so depending on what's caused the stroke, there are different treatments that could happen. If it's caused by blood clots, there are special medications that a person can take that reduces their clotting in their blood, so they're less likely to form clots. And then if a person does have damage to the brain, again, there's therapies that can help them to best cope with that damage and improve their ability to do different tasks. Polio is a disease that we've all been vaccinated against. So polio, people don't get polio generally because we have a vaccine that's very effective and we all get it early on. And so polio was caused by a virus that damages the motor neurons. And so if the motor neurons are damaged, it can lead to a weakness, paralysis, lack of coordination, the muscles sort of wasting away. And so it's a disease that used to kill and affect millions and millions of people. But once the polio vaccine was developed, it's basically in most places unheard of today. These diagrams just show some more information about some of the things I've been talking about. With cerebral palsy, depending on what parts of the brain have been damaged, that's what will determine how that person is impacted. This shows the different types of strokes. A hemorrhagic stroke where a blood vessel is ruptured and now there's bleeding in the brain, leading to blood not reaching the tissues where it needs to get to. Or it can be caused by this blood clot, which again has the same sort of effect as it is stopping the flow of blood to a part of the brain, and then that part of the brain can eventually be damaged permanently. Meningitis, we see these layers surrounding the brain with fluid inside of it, and if that lining and that fluid is infected, again, it puts pressure on the brain, leading to damage to that tissue. Just a few more to finish up here. MS, multiple sclerosis, is, if you think about those neurons, when there's that myelin sheath that is produced along the axon, that sheath helps nerve impulses to efficiently move down the length of the neuron. And in MS, that myelin sheath is damaged and destroyed. And that lack of insulation around the neurons leads to sort of this short circuiting of some of those pathways. It can lead to loss of control of the muscles, and double vision, loss of vision, and sometimes a person with MS may go through periods of time when their symptoms are serious, and other times when they decline somewhat. The symptoms decline. There's not a cure for MS, but there's medications and therapies to help a person that has the disease. Parkinson's disease is a disease caused by a lack of a chemical called dopamine in the brain, and it leads to a person having tremors or shaking, difficulty walking, difficulty in other motor abilities, and so forth. And again, there's not a cure for this, but there are drugs and treatments that can help a person to better cope with the disease. Alzheimer's is a neurological disease in which the neurons of the brain are slowly destroyed, and plaques buildup starts to form in the brain. And so it leads to dementia. My grandmother died of Alzheimer's, and it's sort of over time, memory starts to decline, and eventually it leads to the breakdown of important body functions and so forth. And there's not a known cure for Alzheimer's. There are certain medications that can help with some of the symptoms, but there's not really a medication that slows down the process or stops the process. It has a strong genetic association as well. And then finally, epilepsy is a disease in which neurons of the brain at some points discharge and fire excessively, so that it can lead to a loss of motor control. And, epilepsy can be caused by injuries to the brain as well as genetics. Sometimes brain tumors can bring on episodes of epilepsy. And there are medications that can help to reduce the frequency of epileptic seizures. And they don't have to be an extreme situation in which a person falls on the ground convulsing. There are also types of epilepsy when a person has small seizures that are almost sometimes unnoticeable to an outside person. So there's a variety of different types of epilepsy as well. And here you see just a couple diagrams that help illustrate some of these things. So here we see the effects of MS on the myelin sheathing. Okay, that's breaking down, exposing that underlying neuron, that at the axon of those neurons, and that again leads to the short circuiting of some of that tissue. Here you see the effects on a person's brain of Alzheimer's. There's a general degeneration of the brain tissue. This diagram just shows sort of a visualization of epilepsy when those neurons within the brain are firing sort of at random or excessively. And then finally, Parkinson's disease and some of the various symptoms that arise when a person has Parkinson's. So one of the activities that you're going to do this week is to look at a few different neurological disorders. So I have a whole bunch of these, and you're going to have your choice as to what you want to look at. So I'll just kind of explain a little bit about them so that you can choose. These two, this is about Clive Wearing. He is a gentleman that has what's sometimes called the worst case of amnesia ever. He still has memories and can remember how to, Finn, come here, I'll show you my dog. Come here, say hi. Say hi to everybody. This is Finn. So Clive Wearing has what some people call the most severe case of amnesia. He cannot create any new memories. And so he only has a memory of about 7 seconds. So anything that has just happened to him in the last few seconds he can remember, but then he completely loses his memory of that. But he still remembers things like he remembers his wife. So you'll see in the video, if you watch it, that when his wife comes to visit, he knows it's his wife and he knows he loves her, but he feels like he hasn't ever seen her before, even though he remembers who she is. So he always greets her with a huge hug and a kiss, and he's so excited to see her. And then if she leaves the room for a minute and comes back in, he feels like it's the first time he's ever seen her. So it's sad, but it's interesting to see how the human brain works. He could still remember how to play piano, and he could remember how to speak and things like that. And then this other link that I have I posted is about his journal. And it's interesting to look at because doctors thought giving him a journal would help him to sort of process what had happened to him. But what ended up happening is he would write in the journal things like, "I am alive," and then he would forget that he had just written it a few seconds ago, and he'd look back at it and then cross it off and write it in again. So it's sort of interesting to see. The other video is about SIPA. This is a disorder in which a person has no pain receptors, And so sometimes you'll say, well, that would be great if you didn't have any pain ever. But pain has a purpose, and it's a protective signal for our bodies that some sort of damage is happening or there's some problem. And so when a person doesn't feel pain, it can lead them to hurting themselves or not realizing they're sick or injured. And so this is about a girl who has this disorder. The other option you have is the lobotomist or lobotomies. The videos are a little bit disturbing, I would say. A lobotomy is a procedure in which a person, they were commonly done in the 1940s and 50s, in which a doctor would sever the connection between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. And this was sometimes done as a treatment to somebody that had depression or even attention deficit disorder, we would call it today. They didn't really call it that then, but people that were behavior problems. This treatment, this was before the time of any sort of medications for depression or anxiety things. So this was a treatment that was sometimes used. And the way that Walter Freeman, this doctor, popularized to do a lobotomy was to insert a tool in through the eye socket, like on the side of the eyeball, and into their brain, and then wiggle it around and sever the connection. So they do show it in the video, the lobotomist, they don't show it being done graphically, but they do show it a couple times. And then this is an interesting podcast I heard several years ago, but this gentleman was lobotomized as a 12-year-old boy. And this podcast, it's long. I mean, it's something, I found it interesting. It's an interesting story, but it's him sort of tracing back and trying to figure out why he was lobotomized. And he talks about how it's made him feel since and so forth. I found it really interesting. So you're going to have your choice as to which of these things you explore in one of our assignments for this week. But I just want to tell you a little bit about them. So that's it for today. I know it's a pretty long video, but I hope that you have a good day. It looks nice out, beautiful and sunny, so I hope you can get outside and enjoy some of that. And I hope that you and your family are staying safe and healthy. I miss seeing all you guys, but I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.